If your company cannot answer one simple question, then there is no deal. The words landed like a steel door slamming shut. Every head in the executive boardroom turned toward Zhang Wei as he slowly rose from his chair. The billionaire's expression remained calm, but the silence he left behind was far more frightening than anger. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the 42nd floor of Caldwell Global Headquarters, reflecting the gray Manhattan skyline, and the uneasy faces gathered around the polished conference table. A $2 billion partnership had been months in the making. Teams of lawyers, consultants, analysts, and executives had worked around the clock to reach this moment. Yet now, with only a signature standing between success and disaster, everything was beginning to unravel. Ethan Caldwell felt a bead of sweat slide down the side of his neck. He forced a smile. "Mr. Zhang, perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." Zhang did not respond. Instead, he picked up a thick folder and closed it with deliberate precision. Then he spoke, not in English, not through a translator. Fluent Mandarin filled the room. Fast, sharp, controlled. The executives exchanged confused glances. A few looked toward the translation team seated near the wall. One translator nervously adjusted his glasses. Another stared at his tablet. Neither seemed prepared for the speed of Zhang's words. Ethan's smile weakened. Could someone translate that? Nobody answered immediately. The room felt smaller by the second. Outside, clouds drifted over the city, dimming the afternoon sunlight. Inside, millions of dollars seemed to evaporate with every passing moment. Zhang finished speaking and looked around the table. His eyes settled on Ethan. The silence that followed was devastating. "What did he say?" One executive whispered. "Does anyone know?" Another muttered. Ethan cleared his throat. "Mr. Zhang, if you would prefer English, we can continue." Zhang interrupted him with another sentence in Mandarin, this time even firmer. Then he stepped back from the table. The movement sent a wave of panic through the room. If he walked out, the deal was finished. Months of work would disappear before sunset. Ethan glanced toward the legal team. Nothing. Toward the consultants. Nothing. Toward the translators. Still nothing. For the first time in years, he found himself completely exposed. Then, from the far corner of the room, a quiet voice broke through the tension. "Sir, I believe Mr. Zhang is asking why the shipping projections changed between the first and final reports." The room froze. Every executive turned. Every lawyer turned. Even Zhang Wei turned. Standing beside a service cart near the rear wall was a man nobody had noticed 10 seconds earlier. He wore a dark maintenance uniform. A name patch rested above his pocket. Marcus Reed. In one hand, he held a trash liner. In the other, a cleaning cloth. For a moment, nobody spoke. The contrast felt unreal. Billionaires, CEOs, corporate attorneys, and a janitor. Ethan blinked. "Excuse me." Marcus remained calm. "Mr. Zhang believes the numbers in the revised logistics report don't match the figures presented during the Shanghai meeting." A stunned silence swept across the boardroom. Then Zhang's eyes narrowed. Slowly, almost cautiously, he spoke another sentence in Mandarin. Marcus answered immediately. Fluent, effortless, native level. The billionaire's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for everyone to notice. The room suddenly felt very different. Because for the first time that afternoon, someone understood what Zhang Wei was actually saying. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The soft hum of the ventilation system seemed louder than ever as executives stared across the boardroom at the man standing beside a gray service cart. Marcus Reed did not look like someone who belonged in a billion-dollar negotiation. His maintenance uniform was neatly pressed but worn from years of use. A pair of work gloves protruded from his back pocket. His identification badge hung from a blue lanyard that had clearly seen better days. Yet none of that seemed to matter now. Zhang Wei continued watching him with growing curiosity. Ethan Caldwell felt his pulse quicken. He had spent months preparing for this meeting, hiring consultants from 3 continents and paying experts hundreds of thousands of dollars. Somehow, the only person capable of communicating with the billionaire had been standing inside the room the entire time. Marcus lowered the cleaning cloth in his hand. He remained respectful, careful not to draw attention to himself. That habit had followed him for years. Most people never noticed him, and he had learned not to expect them to. 5 nights a week, he arrived at the building before sunset. He cleaned conference rooms, emptied trash bins, polished glass walls, and made sure executives arrived each morning to spotless floors and shining desks. Few employees knew his name. Most simply nodded in passing or avoided eye contact entirely. Marcus never complained. Work was work. He believed in doing it well. But there was far more to his story than anyone inside that boardroom could imagine. Nearly 20 years earlier, Marcus had lived in Shanghai with his mother, Angela Reed. She had worked as a logistics consultant for international shipping firms, and her assignments often required long stays overseas. While other children spent afternoons playing video games, Marcus sat beside conference tables listening to conversations about cargo routes, manufacturing schedules, and supply chains. At first, Mandarin sounded like a blur of unfamiliar sounds. Over time, those sounds became words, then sentences, then entire conversations. By the time he graduated high school, he spoke the language fluently. Years later, he earned a degree in international logistics and built a successful career coordinating freight operations across Asia and North America. His future had once seemed limitless. Then life changed. His mother became seriously ill. Hospital visits replaced business trips. Medical appointments replaced conferences. Marcus stepped away from his career without hesitation. Family came first. After she passed away, he discovered how quickly the professional world moved on. Companies hired younger candidates. Opportunities disappeared. Savings dwindled. Eventually, he accepted maintenance work simply to keep moving forward. None of the executives surrounding that table knew any of this. To them, he was just the janitor. Zhang suddenly spoke another sentence in Mandarin. His voice carried calm authority. Marcus listened carefully before answering. Their exchange lasted only a few moments, but the billionaire's expression shifted again. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Several executives looked increasingly uncomfortable. One director leaned toward another and whispered something behind a folder. Marcus pretended not to notice. He had heard similar whispers before. Ethan watched the interaction unfold with growing confusion. The deal that had been collapsing minutes earlier now seemed suspended in uncertainty. Then Zhang placed both hands on the conference table and spoke directly to Marcus. The room waited. Marcus listened. His eyes moved briefly toward a financial report lying open near the center of the table. When he looked back up, the confidence in his face remained unchanged. And for the first time that afternoon, it became clear that the billionaire was not interested in leaving because of a language barrier. He was focused on something far more serious. Marcus looked down at the report resting on the conference table. The pages were filled with projections, shipping forecasts, warehouse costs, and international distribution estimates. To most people in the room, the numbers represented profit. To Marcus, they told a story. And something about that story did not make sense. Zhang Wei spoke again in Mandarin, his voice measured and deliberate. Marcus listened carefully before translating. Mr. Zhang says the projected shipping costs dropped by nearly 12% between the second and final reports. He wants to know why. A ripple of discomfort moved around the table. Several executives immediately began flipping through documents. Others opened laptops. Ethan Caldwell leaned forward. That adjustment came from our logistics department, he said. We identified new efficiencies. Marcus translated the response. Zhang listened without interruption. Then he asked another question. Marcus answered after only a brief pause. He would like to know why the port handling fees remained unchanged if those efficiencies were real. The room grew quieter. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Across the table, Richard Holloway, Senior Vice President of Operations, adjusted his tie. Richard had overseen the final logistics package. He was known for confidence, precision, and an ability to explain almost anything. Yet for the first time that afternoon, he looked uncomfortable. Tell him the projections were reviewed by our entire department, Richard said. Everything was verified. Marcus translated the statement. Zhang stared at Richard for several seconds before responding. This time his tone was noticeably firmer. Marcus remained calm. Mr. Zhang says his analysts reached a different conclusion. The words landed heavily. Ethan noticed several board members exchange uneasy glances. For months, everyone had assumed Zhang's team would approve the agreement. Nobody had expected resistance at the final stage. Marcus carefully studied the report again. Certain figures stood out immediately. Years spent working in international logistics had trained him to spot inconsistencies quickly. Shipping routes rarely became cheaper overnight. Port fees rarely remained frozen, while transportation costs dropped dramatically. Markets simply did not behave that way. He turned a page, then another. The sunlight beyond the glass windows faded behind a blanket of clouds, casting a cooler gray light across the boardroom. Marcus felt a familiar sensation growing in the back of his mind. It was the same feeling he used to get before identifying a costly mistake during his years in logistics management. A detail everyone else overlooked. A number that appeared harmless until examined closely. Zhang suddenly asked another question. Marcus listened. His eyes narrowed slightly as he processed the wording. Then he translated. Mr. Zhang wants to know why the revised shipping schedule assumes access to Harbor Terminal 8. Silence. Complete silence. Ethan looked toward Richard. Richard did not answer immediately. His face lost color. Marcus noticed it at once. So did Zhang. The billionaire folded his hands and waited. 20 seconds passed. Then 30. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. Terminal 8 is expected to become available next quarter. Marcus. Translated. Zhang responded instantly. Marcus listened before speaking. Mr. Zhang says Terminal 8 is under an exclusive 5-year contract with another carrier. The words seemed to drain the air from the room. Several executives looked shocked. One board member quickly searched something on his phone. Another opened a market report. Ethan stared directly at Richard. For the first time all afternoon, the chief executive was no longer worried about losing a deal. He was beginning to wonder whether someone inside his own company had given him information that was never true in the first place. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Richard Holloway sat motionless beneath the cool glow of the conference room lights. The reflection of financial charts shimmered across the polished table between him and the rest of the board. Ethan Caldwell kept his eyes fixed on him. The confidence that had defined Richard for years was beginning to crack. Around the room, executives quietly reviewed documents, searching for answers that should have been available long before the meeting began. Zhang Wei remained patient. That patience somehow made the tension worse. He was not raising his voice. He was not making demands. He was simply waiting for the truth. Marcus stood near the rear wall, still beside the service cart where this entire chain of events had started. Part of him wished he could disappear back into the background. Yet another part understood that walking away now would leave important questions unanswered. Zhang spoke again in Mandarin. His words were calm but direct. Marcus listened carefully before translating. Mr. Zhang says his analyst discovered the Terminal 8 issue 3 weeks ago. He chose not to mention it because he wanted to see whether anyone from Caldwell Global would identify the discrepancy first. Several board members exchanged uneasy looks. Ethan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. 3 weeks. That meant the billionaire had been watching, evaluating, waiting. Richard finally spoke. There may have been a misunderstanding regarding future availability projections. His voice sounded weaker than before. Marcus translated the statement. Zhang listened. Then he asked a short question. Marcus responded almost immediately. He wants to know who approved the final report. Nobody spoke. The answer was obvious. Richard lowered his eyes toward the table. The room suddenly felt smaller. Ethan slowly opened the report in front of him. For years, he had trusted summaries and executive briefings. He trusted department heads to verify details. That was how large companies operated. Yet now he found himself reading line after line, noticing issues that should never have survived internal review. Shipping assumptions, warehouse estimates, forecast adjustments. Individually, each change appeared minor. Together, they painted a very different picture. Marcus quietly stepped closer to the table. He hesitated before speaking. Sir, may I point something out? Ethan looked up. For a brief moment, the room seemed surprised that the janitor had asked permission rather than forcing his opinion into the discussion. Ethan nodded. Go ahead. Marcus leaned slightly toward the report. The projected savings depend on 3 separate assumptions occurring at the same time. Reduced handling fees, increased port access, and lower fuel surcharges. Any one of those might be possible. All 3 together are extremely unlikely. Several executives immediately looked down at the pages. Calculators appeared. Laptop screens filled with spreadsheets. The sound of typing echoed softly across the room. Marcus continued carefully. If even one assumption fails, the projected savings disappear. Ethan's expression darkened. He could already see the implications. The deal itself was not the problem. The numbers supporting it were. Zhang watched Marcus with growing interest. Then he asked another question in Mandarin. This time, Marcus paused longer before translating. Mr. Zhang says he believes the partnership could still succeed. Hope flickered across several faces. But Marcus was not finished. However, he says trust cannot exist where facts are uncertain. The words settled over the room like a final verdict. No one argued. No one objected. Because for the first time all afternoon, everyone understood what was really happening. The billionaire had never come to test their language skills. He had come to test their integrity. And the person who recognized that first had not been a senior executive, a consultant, or a board member. It had been the man carrying a trash bag and a cleaning cloth. No one rushed to speak after that. The boardroom remained suspended in a strange stillness, as though every person present was trying to process the same uncomfortable realization. Outside the windows, the afternoon sky had darkened into a blanket of silver clouds drifting above Manhattan. Inside, the glow from laptop screens reflected across polished wood and anxious faces. Ethan Caldwell slowly closed the report in front of him. The sound seemed unusually loud in the silence. For years he had built a reputation as a leader who demanded excellence. Yet somehow a critical flaw had traveled through layers of management, approvals, presentations, and reviews without being challenged. That fact bothered him far more than the possibility of losing a deal. Across the table, Richard Holloway sat with his hands folded. The confidence that once defined him had faded completely. Several executives had already begun quietly reviewing older versions of the logistics reports. One finance director compared spreadsheets line by line. Another checked archive projections from 6 months earlier. The deeper they looked, the more questions appeared. Zhang Wei observed everything without interruption. His calm demeanor seemed to amplify the pressure in the room. He was not interested in excuses. He was interested in honesty. Marcus remained standing near the table. Part of him wanted to step back and return to the background where he was comfortable. Yet every time Zhang asked a question, the room instinctively looked toward him. The irony was impossible to ignore. People who had barely acknowledged his existence an hour earlier were now waiting for his voice before making decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Zhang spoke again in Mandarin. His tone remained steady. Marcus listened before translating. Mr. Zhang would like to know when the revised projections were introduced. Ethan turned immediately toward Richard. The answer came after a noticeable pause. About 6 weeks ago. Marcus translated. Zhang nodded slowly. Then another question followed. Marcus listened. His eyes moved briefly toward the spreadsheets displayed on nearby screens. Mr. Zhang asks whether independent verification was performed before the projections were approved. The question landed heavily. Nobody answered immediately. The silence itself felt like an answer. Ethan leaned back in his chair. His jaw tightened. He was beginning to see a pattern. Assumptions had become facts. Estimates had become guarantees. Nobody had stopped to challenge them. Nobody except the person who was never expected to be part of the conversation. One executive suddenly spoke up. How did you even notice all this? The question was directed at Marcus. Several people turned toward him. Marcus hesitated. He was not accustomed to being the center of attention. I spent years working in international logistics, he said quietly. When you look at enough shipping reports, certain numbers start standing out. A few eyebrows rose around the room. The answer created even more questions. Richard looked genuinely surprised. So did Ethan. Neither man had ever asked about Marcus's background. Neither had considered that the quiet maintenance worker cleaning conference rooms after hours might possess expertise far beyond his current position. Zhang listened carefully as Marcus translated his own explanation into Mandarin. For the first time that afternoon, the billionaire smiled openly. It was not a smile of victory. It was a smile of recognition. The kind one professional gives another after discovering genuine competence. Then Zhang asked one final question. Marcus listened. The room waited. Even the faint clicking of keyboards stopped. Marcus took a breath before translating. Mr. Zhang wants to know whether Caldwell Global values truth more than appearances. The question settled over the boardroom like a weight. No spreadsheet could answer it. No consultant could answer it. And suddenly everyone understood that the future of the partnership depended entirely on how Ethan Caldwell chose to respond. The question lingered in the air long after Marcus finished translating it. Nobody reached for a keyboard. Nobody shuffled papers. Even the city beyond the windows seemed quieter. The distant skyline softened beneath a curtain of gathering clouds. Ethan Caldwell sat motionless at the head of the table. For the first time in years, there was no presentation to hide behind, no carefully prepared talking point, no polished answer waiting in a binder. There was only a simple question. Did his company value truth more than appearances? The reflection of the boardroom lights shimmered across the dark wood table. Ethan looked at the report in front of him, then at the executives surrounding him. Some avoided eye contact. Others stared at spreadsheets that no longer seemed capable of solving the problem. Across the room, Marcus stood quietly beside the service cart. He had no title on the wall, no reserved parking space, no executive assistant managing his calendar. Yet somehow he seemed more at ease than anyone else present. Zhang Wei watched the room with calm patience. He was not pressuring anyone. He was simply waiting to see who they would choose to be when the comfortable answers disappeared. Ethan slowly folded his hands. "Tell him the truth," he said. Marcus translated the words into Mandarin. Zhang listened without changing expression. Ethan continued. "Tell him we failed to catch the errors. Tell him we trusted assumptions that should have been challenged. Tell him that is our responsibility." Marcus translated each sentence carefully. The room remained silent. No one interrupted. No one objected. As the final words settled, something subtle shifted in the atmosphere. The tension was still there, but it felt different now. Less like panic, more like clarity. Outside, a ray of late afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds and stretched across the windows. A pale golden reflection moved across the conference table before settling near the stack of reports at its center. Marcus noticed it immediately. The light reminded him of afternoons years earlier in Shanghai, sitting beside his mother near the harbor, listening to cargo ships sound their horns. Across the water, she used to tell him that the truth was like a lighthouse. Sometimes people ignored it because it exposed mistakes, but eventually everyone needed it to find their way home. He had not thought about those words in years. Zhang spoke softly in Mandarin. This time there was no urgency in his voice. Marcus listened. The billionaire's words were slower now, thoughtful. After a moment, Marcus translated. "Mr. Zhang says honesty does not erase mistakes, but honesty creates the possibility of trust." No one moved. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. Several executives seemed relieved simply to hear the conversation moving forward again. The room no longer felt like a battlefield of competing explanations. It felt like a place where people were finally confronting reality. The sunlight continued spreading across the glass walls. The city glowed beneath it. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of the building itself. And in that rare stillness, Marcus realized something unexpected. He had entered the room carrying a trash bag and a cleaning cloth. Yet somehow, without intending to, he had helped everyone see what truly mattered. Zhang Wei remained silent for several seconds after Marcus finished translating. The sunlight resting across the conference table seemed brighter now, cutting through the gray atmosphere that had dominated the room all afternoon. Then, unexpectedly, the billionaire began to smile. It was not the polite smile of a negotiator. It was the smile of a man who had finally reached the moment he had been waiting for. Several executives noticed it immediately. Ethan Caldwell sat forward. Richard Holloway looked confused. Marcus simply listened. Zhang spoke in Mandarin again, but this time there was something different in his voice. The tension was gone. In its place was certainty. Marcus listened carefully, then paused. For the first time all day, even he seemed surprised. "Mr. Zhang says there is something everyone here should know." Every eye in the room fixed on him. The billionaire continued speaking. Marcus translated slowly. "He says he never needed a translator today." A wave of confusion moved through the boardroom. Several executives exchanged puzzled looks. Ethan blinked. "What does that mean?" Marcus asked the question in Mandarin. Zhang answered immediately. Then came the revelation. "Mr. Zhang says he has spoken fluent English for more than 30 years. Complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Ethan stared across the table. Richard's expression froze. Even the board members looked stunned. Marcus translated the rest. "He says he understood every presentation, every projection, every conversation, and every explanation from the moment he entered the building." The room seemed to stop breathing. Ethan slowly leaned back in his chair. Suddenly, every awkward pause from earlier made sense. Every question, every reaction, every moment. Zhang had not refused English because he could not understand it. He had refused English because he wanted to observe what happened when people became uncomfortable. The billionaire continued. Marcus listened. Mr. Zhang says language was never the test. The room remained silent. Integrity was the test. The words settled over the boardroom with remarkable force. Nobody could argue with them because everyone now understood exactly what had happened. Zhang's analysts had discovered the inconsistencies weeks earlier. He could have canceled the meeting. He could have walked away. Instead, he created an environment where people would reveal themselves. Some protected appearances. Some protected assumptions. Some protected their positions. Only one person consistently protected the truth. Marcus felt dozens of eyes shift toward him. The attention made him uncomfortable. He looked down briefly. Zhang spoke again. His voice carried warmth now. Marcus translated. Mr. Zhang says the most valuable person in this room is not the person with the highest title. It is the person willing to speak honestly when remaining silent would be easier. Ethan lowered his gaze. Richard said nothing. Several executives appeared embarrassed. Not because they lacked intelligence. Not because they lacked experience. But because they had overlooked the one individual who saw the problem clearly. Marcus stood quietly beside the service cart. The same cart. The same uniform. The same man everyone had ignored for months. Yet somehow he had become the reason a $2 billion partnership still had a future. Then Zhang Wei stood from his chair and looked directly at Marcus Reed. The respect in his expression was impossible to miss. And for the first time that afternoon, the entire room saw Marcus exactly the way the billionaire did. For several moments after Zhang Wei's words were translated, nobody spoke. The boardroom felt completely different from the one that had existed only an hour earlier. The tension that had once come from uncertainty had been replaced by something far more uncomfortable: self-reflection. Ethan Caldwell slowly rose from his chair. The movement drew every eye in the room. Throughout his career, he had been known for confidence, decisiveness, and control. Yet now there was humility in his expression. He looked first toward Zhang, then toward Marcus. The maintenance worker stood exactly where he had been standing all afternoon, beside the service cart that had somehow become the most unlikely symbol of the day. Ethan took a slow breath. Marcus, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. The room fell silent again. Marcus looked surprised. Ethan continued. You have worked in this building for years. I pass people like you every day. I tell myself I value every employee, but today proved something different. I never asked about your experience. I never asked about your background. I saw a uniform and assumed I knew your story. Nobody interrupted. The honesty in his voice made that impossible. Marcus shifted slightly, uncomfortable with being the center of attention. You do not owe me anything, sir, he said. Ethan shook his head. Yes, I do. The chief executive glanced around the room. And I suspect I am not the only one. Several executives lowered their eyes. Richard Holloway remained silent, staring at the reports spread across the table. The mistakes they contained suddenly seemed much smaller than the assumptions people had made about one another. Zhang listened carefully as Marcus translated the exchange. The billionaire nodded with quiet approval. Then he spoke in Mandarin once more. Marcus listened before smiling faintly. It was perhaps the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him all afternoon. Mr. Zhang says leadership is not measured by never making mistakes. Leadership is measured by what happens after the mistake becomes visible. The words settled gently over the room. Ethan nodded. He is right. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan walked toward Marcus and extended his hand. There was no audience beyond the people already present. No cameras. No reporters. No publicity value. Just a simple gesture of respect. Marcus looked at the hand for a moment before accepting it. The handshake was brief, but meaningful. Around the table, several executives seemed relieved. Not because the deal was saved. Not because the financial questions had disappeared. But because the room finally felt honest. Ethan turned toward Zhang. If you are willing, we will rebuild the projections from the ground up. Every assumption. Every number. Every detail. Marcus translated. Zhang listened, then smiled. Mr. Zhang says that is exactly the answer he hoped to hear. A quiet sense of optimism began to return. The partnership still required work. The reports still needed correction. But trust, once damaged, was beginning to recover. And standing in the middle of it all was a man who had never asked for recognition, never demanded attention, and never tried to embarrass anyone. Marcus had simply chosen to tell the truth when it mattered most. Somehow, that choice had changed the direction of the entire day. 3 weeks later, the atmosphere inside Caldwell Global felt remarkably different. The crisis that had nearly destroyed the partnership had become the catalyst for something far more valuable. Every projection had been rebuilt. Every assumption had been verified. Every department had been required to defend its numbers with evidence instead of confidence alone. The process was slower, but it was honest. On a clear autumn morning, sunlight streamed through the glass walls of the headquarters, casting long reflections across the lobby floor. Employees moved through the building carrying coffee cups, laptops, and meeting folders. Yet, one small detail near the executive wing continued to attract attention. Mounted beside a new office door was a polished silver nameplate. Marcus Reed, Senior Global Advisor. People still paused when they saw it. Some smiled. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Marcus himself never seemed particularly interested in the title. Most mornings he arrived early, carrying the same quiet demeanor that had defined him long before anyone knew his story. He spent his days reviewing logistics strategies, helping teams identify risks, and offering insights drawn from decades of experience. What surprised people most was that success had not changed him. He treated receptionists the same way he treated executives. He listened more than he spoke. He gave credit freely. And whenever someone congratulated him, he usually redirected the conversation toward the team. One afternoon, Ethan Caldwell stood inside his office looking down at the city below. The partnership with Zhang Wei had officially been approved. Analysts were already calling it one of the most promising international ventures of the year. Yet Ethan found himself thinking less about the deal and more about the lesson behind it. A soft knock sounded at the door. Marcus stepped inside carrying a report. "You wanted to review the shipping updates?" he asked. Ethan smiled. "In a minute." Marcus looked curious. Ethan glanced toward the skyline before speaking. "You know, I spent years believing leadership meant having the right answers." Marcus remained silent. "Now I think leadership starts with asking the right questions." Marcus smiled faintly. "My mother used to say something similar." Ethan nodded. "She sounds wise." For a moment, both men stood quietly as sunlight reflected from the neighboring buildings. The city seemed calmer somehow, not because challenges had disappeared, but because perspective had changed. Later that evening, after most employees had gone home, Marcus walked through the nearly empty hallway outside the boardroom where everything had begun. The lights were dimmer now. The building felt peaceful. He paused briefly outside the conference room door. Through the glass, he could see the long table where billion-dollar decisions were made. The same table where nobody had noticed him until the moment truth became necessary. Marcus did not feel bitterness when he remembered that day. Only gratitude. Gratitude for his mother. Gratitude for the lessons she left behind. Gratitude that doing the right thing had mattered. He continued down the hallway as the last light of sunset painted the windows gold. The city glowed beneath the evening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a ferry horn echoed across the river. Marcus walked forward with quiet confidence, not because people finally recognized his worth, but because he had never forgotten it. And as the golden reflection followed him down the hall, the building settled into silence, carrying with it a simple truth that everyone inside would remember for years to come. Kindness does not make a person weak. Character is what gives strength its meaning.